The pounding on my front door didn't sound like a mistake. It sounded like something breaking. Not wood. Not glass. Something deeper. I woke up to the sound before my mind could even form a thought. The clock beside my bed glowed faintly in the dark. 2 a.m. No one visits at that hour. No one knocks that hard unless something is terribly wrong. The knocking came again. Louder this time. Faster. Urgent. My heart started racing before my feet even touched the floor. I pulled on a shirt. My hands stiff. My mouth dry. Every instinct inside me told me not to open that door. That nothing good was waiting on the other side. But the knocking didn't stop. It demanded. I walked down the hallway. Each step slower than the last. My breath shallow. The porch light flicked on when I hit the switch, casting shadows through the frosted glass panel in the door. 3 figures stood outside. Tall. Still. Uniformed. Police. A cold rush slid down my spine. Police never show up at 2 a.m. with good news. I opened the door. The night air hit my face. Sharp and unforgiving. 2 officers stood directly in front of me. Their expressions serious. Unreadable. A third stood slightly behind them, watching everything with quiet attention. Mr. Marcus Hale, the lead officer asked. My throat felt tight, but I nodded. Yes. He didn't waste time. You're being detained. The words didn't register at first. They floated somewhere above my head. Meaningless. Impossible. Detained. That word didn't belong to my life. Not to me. I opened my mouth to ask why, but then I saw her, standing just behind the officers. My wife, Eleanor. Still. Silent. She wasn't crying. She wasn't arguing. She wasn't demanding answers. She wasn't even looking directly at me. Her arms were folded tightly across her chest. Her eyes lowered like she didn't want to be seen. That silence hit harder than the officer's words. That was the moment something inside me cracked. What is this about? I finally managed to ask. My voice rough. The lead officer shifted slightly, pulling a folded document from his hand. There's an ongoing investigation involving suspicious financial activity connected to company accounts under your authorization. Financial activity. For a moment, my mind went completely blank. I tried to replay the last few weeks in my head, every approval, every transfer, every report I'd signed, but nothing stood out. Nothing felt wrong. I think there's been some kind of mistake, I said carefully. I haven't authorized anything unusual. The officer didn't react. Instead, he asked, how long have you managed the financial accounts for Riverside Holdings? That question made my chest tighten. Over 15 years? I answered. Riverside Holdings wasn't just a company. It was my father's legacy. A construction business built from nothing, brick by brick. Contract by contract. I had spent half my life protecting it. And now police were standing at my door because of it. I turned again toward Eleanor. Did you know about this? I asked. My voice wasn't angry. Not yet. Just confused. Searching. She hesitated. Too long. I didn't know what to believe, she said quietly. That answer cut deeper than anything else that night. Not I didn't know. Not this must be a mistake. Just uncertainty. The officers stepped slightly closer. Sir, we need you to come with us, the lead officer said. Not arrested. Detained. The difference mattered, but it didn't make the moment any easier. I stepped outside slowly, the cold air wrapping around me like something alive. Across the street, a porch light flicked on. Someone had noticed the flashing patrol lights. Someone was watching. The humiliation settled in quietly. I glanced back at the doorway. Eleanor still stood there, frozen in place, her arms still folded, her face pale under the porch light. She didn't step forward. She didn't speak. She just watched. That silence followed me as I walked toward the patrol car. How long have you personally handled authorization approvals? One officer asked as he opened the rear door. Every major transaction. I replied automatically. The door shut behind me with a heavy metallic click. Locked. That sound echoed louder than anything else. Inside the car, the air felt tight and stale. I stared straight ahead as the vehicle pulled away from the curb, the familiar outline of my home shrinking behind us. My thoughts began racing. Who accused me? What transaction? Why now? We flagged a transfer earlier this week, the officer in the front seat said casually, glancing at me through the rearview mirror. What transfer? I asked immediately. He didn't answer right away, just watched my reflection for a moment, then said, one that carried your digital approval. That made no sense. I hadn't approved anything. Not recently. Not remotely like what he was describing. By the time we reached the station, my chest felt tight with pressure I couldn't release. Bright fluorescent lights filled the entryway as I stepped out of the vehicle. The inside of the station smelled sterile, clean but cold, like something designed to remove comfort from the air. They led me to a desk. A uniformed officer behind the counter looked up. Is this the same Hale from Riverside Holdings? He asked. Yes, the escorting officer replied. That name carried weight here. I could see it in the man's eyes. He reached for a file. Thick. Already prepared. That alone made my stomach twist. He opened the folder slowly, scanning the first page with practiced efficiency. I sat silently across from him, watching every movement, every shift in his expression. At first, nothing changed. Just routine reading. Then, he froze. Not dramatically, just enough to notice. His eyes paused on something halfway down the page. He leaned forward slightly, flipping to the next sheet, then back again. His fingers tightened around the edge of the paper. Another officer stepped closer. What is it? He asked quietly. The desk officer didn't answer immediately. Instead, he flipped another page, then another. His breathing changed, subtle, but noticeable. Finally, he reached for the phone beside him. I watched as he dialed a number from memory. His voice dropped to a whisper. We need to notify the chief. He didn't look at the other officers. He looked directly at me, like I wasn't just a suspect anymore, like I was something else entirely. The room stayed quiet after he ended the call. Too quiet. Not the kind of quiet that meant nothing was happening, but the kind that meant something important had just begun. The officer didn't hang up and return to his paperwork like this was routine. He kept staring at the open file in front of him, flipping slowly from page to page as if he were afraid to miss something. I sat across from him, my hands resting on my knees, trying to keep my breathing steady. The fluorescent lights above us hummed faintly, filling the silence with a thin, mechanical sound. He didn't look at me right away. He just kept reading, carefully, like every word mattered. Something inside that folder wasn't what they expected. That realization settled deep in my chest, tightening everything inside me. Fear was still there, pressing against my ribs. But now something else was growing alongside it. Curiosity, sharp and dangerous. Finally, he looked up. When was the last time you personally approved an international transfer? He asked. The question hit me like a sudden gust of cold air. International, I repeated. I haven't approved any international transfers recently. He didn't respond immediately. Instead, he leaned back slightly and tapped the file with 2 fingers. A large offshore transfer attempt was flagged earlier this week, he said. Company funds were involved. My mind raced. Offshore transfer. That wasn't just unusual. That was serious. Every major transaction at Riverside Holdings went through layers of review. Nothing moved without my approval. I didn't authorize anything like that, I said firmly. Not recently. The officer studied me closely, his eyes narrowing just enough to show doubt. The authorization contained your digital approval signature, he said. For a moment, I forgot how to breathe. My signature. That didn't make sense. Not technically. Not legally. Not practically. There were only a handful of people authorized to process high-level approvals. And even then, my confirmation was required. Every major transfer passed through systems I personally monitored. Something was wrong. Very wrong. Can you explain that? He asked. I can explain that I didn't approve any transfer, I replied. That system requires authentication I control. No one else has unrestricted access. That answer seemed to interest him more than challenge him. He flipped another page in the file. Tell me about Riverside Holdings, he said. I swallowed slowly. It's a family business, I answered. Construction. My father started it over 30 years ago. We built it from the ground up, residential developments, commercial contracts, infrastructure jobs. He nodded slightly, jotting notes on a yellow pad. And your role? I manage financial oversight, I said. Budgets, authorizations, long-term investments. Who else has administrative access to the financial system? That question made my stomach tighten. Very few people had that kind of access. It wasn't something handed out casually. Every credential represented trust and risk. A limited number, I said carefully. Senior staff. A few trusted family members. The officer paused. That single word, family, hung in the air like smoke. He flipped deeper into the file. There is a reporting witness connected to this transaction, he said. My heartbeat quickened. A witness? I asked. He nodded without looking up. Someone claims you instructed them verbally to initiate the transfer. The word struck harder than any accusation so far. That's not true, I said immediately. Not hesitation. Not confusion. Certainty. Whoever made that claim was lying. Not mistaken. Lying. He continued reading. I leaned forward slightly, my pulse pounding in my ears. Who is it? I asked. He didn't answer directly. Instead, he read the name quietly to himself, then closed the page halfway, like he wasn't ready to reveal everything yet. But the look on his face told me enough. This wasn't an outsider. This wasn't random. This came from inside, from someone who knew how the company worked, someone who understood how to make their accusation believable. That realization settled deep in my chest. Heavier than fear, it felt like betrayal. He slid a printed document across the desk toward me. Take a look at this, he said. I leaned forward and scanned the page. Transaction details, account numbers, dates. Then I saw the timestamp, and everything inside me froze. That date! I remembered that day clearly. Too clearly. I wasn't at the office that afternoon. I had been at the hospital, visiting my sister after her surgery. I remembered the sterile smell of the waiting room, the plastic chair under me, the sound of nurses calling names down the hallway. I hadn't been near a computer that day, not even close. That timestamp is wrong, I said slowly. The officer watched me carefully. Wrong how? I wasn't at the office that day, I said. I was at the hospital. His pen stopped moving. You're certain? Yes, I answered. I stayed there most of the afternoon. He wrote something quickly on his pad. That single detail shifted the balance inside the room. Not dramatically, not visibly, but I could feel it. Like the weight had shifted slightly off my shoulders. Another officer walked into the room briefly, leaning close to whisper something to the desk officer. I caught only fragments. Records not matching. Older accounts? Older accounts. That phrase hit something buried deep in my memory, something I hadn't thought about in years. Legacy accounts. Accounts my father had established decades ago. Protected structures designed to secure family assets across generations. They weren't part of daily operations. They weren't meant to be touched unless absolutely necessary. My mind drifted briefly back to those conversations with my father, the seriousness in his voice when he explained why those accounts existed in the first place. Protection. Insurance. Preparation. The desk officer returned his attention to me. Did you recently update any old trust records? He asked. My head snapped slightly. No, I said. I haven't touched those accounts in years. He exchanged another look with the second officer. A quiet one. The kind that didn't need words. Something bigger was unfolding. Something older. Something deeper than a simple financial transfer. Footsteps echoed faintly down the hallway outside the room. Slow. Deliberate. Measured. The officers straightened slightly, adjusting their posture without realizing it. That shift didn't go unnoticed. I watched the desk officer close the file carefully and place it flat on the surface in front of him. He looked directly at me. Not like I was guilty. Not like I was dangerous. Like I was important to whatever came next. "The chief is reviewing your file personally," he said quietly. That sentence settled over me like a heavy blanket. Not routine. Not ordinary. Personal involvement meant this case was bigger than I had imagined. Much bigger. The sound of footsteps stopped just outside the door. The handle shifted slightly. My heart began pounding against my ribs. Whatever happened next would change everything. The door started to open. The door opened slowly. Not with urgency, but with quiet control. A man stepped inside, older than the others. His posture straight. His expression calm. He didn't rush. Didn't speak immediately. The officers around the room shifted almost automatically, straightening their backs, adjusting their stance. Respect filled the room before he even said a word. That alone told me who he was. The chief. He walked toward the desk with steady steps. The kind of steps that belonged to someone used to being listened to. Not loud. Not aggressive. Just certain. But what unsettled me most wasn't his authority. It was his expression. He didn't look angry. He looked confused. That was worse. He stopped a few feet in front of me, picked up the file from the desk, and opened it without sitting. The papers made a soft rustling sound as he flipped through them, his eyes moving carefully from line to line. Then he looked up, straight at me. "Mr. Marcus Hale." The way he said my name made my chest tighten. Not harsh, not accusing, measured. Like he was confirming something he already suspected. I nodded slowly. Yes. He didn't respond right away. Just studied my face longer than felt comfortable, as if searching for recognition. For a strange moment, I wondered if I had seen him before. Maybe at a city council meeting. Maybe at a public event tied to one of our construction projects. But nothing clear surfaced. He finally pulled out the chair across from me and sat down. Not hurried. Not careless. Deliberate. He flipped to a specific section in the file and tapped it lightly with his finger. "When was the last time you reviewed your legacy accounts?" he asked. That question landed harder than any accusation so far. Legacy accounts. Not company funds. Not routine transfers. Legacy accounts. My mind raced. "I haven't reviewed those in years," I answered slowly. "They aren't part of daily operations." He nodded once, as if that response confirmed something. Not surprised. Not doubtful. Just satisfied. That reaction unsettled me more than anything else that night. Legacy accounts weren't public knowledge. They weren't discussed casually, not even within the company. They were established decades ago by my father, designed to secure long-term assets that would pass down through generations. Most people didn't even know they existed. So why was he asking about them now? He flipped another page in the file. "Your father established several restricted financial structures," he said calmly. The mention of my father pulled something loose inside my memory. For a moment, I wasn't sitting under harsh station lights. I was standing in my father's office years ago. The smell of old paper and polished wood surrounding me. He sat behind his desk, glasses resting low on his nose. Stacks of documents spread in front of him. I had been younger then, less cautious, more confident, convinced that loyalty alone could protect everything we built. "Marcus," he had said, tapping a page with his pen. "Never trust numbers without witnesses." I remembered the firmness in his voice. Not angry. Not dramatic. Certain. "These accounts," he continued, "exist to protect this family from outside threats and sometimes from inside ones." At the time, I didn't fully understand what he meant. Inside threats. It had sounded paranoid back then. Now, sitting under those bright lights, it didn't sound paranoid at all. It sounded prophetic. The memory faded, and I found myself back in the station, staring at the chief as he placed a sheet of paper in front of me. "Take a look at this," he said. I leaned forward slowly. A list of accounts stared back at me. Not just operating accounts, not just vendor lines, legacy accounts. My father's structures. One number in particular caught my eye. My breath caught in my throat. That account shouldn't be there, I said quietly. The chief didn't speak, just watched me. That account was closed years ago. I continued. After my father passed, we consolidated everything. It shouldn't still be active. He leaned back slightly, folding his hands in front of him. That's what makes this situation unusual, he said. Unusual. That word barely scratched the surface. If that account was active, something had been reopened. Something had been accessed. And not by accident. A slow, cold realization began forming in my chest. Someone had touched those accounts. Someone who knew exactly where to look. The chief studied my reaction carefully. His expression steady but thoughtful. This situation may not be what it first appeared, he said. I lifted my eyes to meet his. For the first time since that knock on my door, a small fragment of hope stirred beneath the fear. Not freedom. Not relief. Just possibility. Then he added another sentence. This accusation may not be about money. That stopped my thoughts entirely. Not about money. Then what? Money was the only reason anyone would attempt something like this. Financial fraud. Unauthorized transfers. Stolen assets. That was the only explanation that made sense. Unless money was only the surface. Unless something deeper was hiding beneath it. The chief opened the file again and pointed to another section. Access logs tied to your legacy records show multiple login attempts, he said. Multiple, I repeated. Yes, he answered. Not random attempts. Structured ones. Patterned over time. That word, patterned, felt deliberate. Strategic. Not panic. Not impulse. Planning. My mind raced through possibilities. Who even knew those accounts existed? Very few people. Family. A handful of trusted insiders. That was it. The chief leaned forward slightly. Who else knows about those accounts? He asked. The question didn't feel procedural. It felt personal. I swallowed slowly. Very few people. I answered. My father, myself, and certain family members who were involved in long-term planning. He nodded slowly, absorbing the information. Then he closed the file. Carefully, like the movement itself carried weight. He held my gaze for several seconds before speaking again. This accusation may have been designed to draw attention away from something else, he said. The words settled into the air like dust after an explosion. Draw attention away. A distraction. Not the main event. That thought sent a cold wave through my chest. Someone hadn't just accused me. Someone had used me. Used the accusation as cover. Used the investigation as camouflage. The chief stood up slowly, pushing the chair back with a soft scrape against the floor. We're going to need to examine every record you have, he said. Every record. Not just company files. Everything. My pulse thudded heavily in my ears. As he turned to leave, he paused briefly near the door, glancing back at me one last time. Not with suspicion. Not with hostility. With something closer to warning. I lowered my eyes to the sheet still resting on the desk in front of me. My gaze locked onto that account number. The one I thought had disappeared years ago. The one that shouldn't exist anymore. But did, and for the first time since this nightmare began, I realized something terrifying. Tonight hadn't been the beginning. It had only been the first visible crack. The stack of papers they brought in felt heavier than it should have. Not because of the weight, but because of what it meant. The chief nodded once to the officer beside him. Bring the full transaction records. A few minutes later, another thick bundle of documents landed on the desk in front of me with a dull thud. The sound echoed in the quiet room like something final. Take your time, the chief said. I leaned forward, pulling the top sheet closer. Rows of numbers, dates, authorization lines, familiar formatting, familiar structure. At first glance, everything looked normal. Too normal. Then I saw my name, signed neatly at the bottom of a transfer authorization. Marcus Hale. Perfect. Clean. Professional. But something felt wrong. Not obvious. Not dramatic. Just off. I stared at the signature longer than I should have, leaning closer until the letters blurred slightly under the harsh fluorescent light. My chest tightened. "That's not right," I murmured. The chief didn't react immediately. Instead, he watched me closely. "What's not right?" he asked. I tapped the paper lightly. "The signature," I said. "It looks correct, but it isn't." I swallowed slowly, forcing myself to focus. "The spacing between the letters is slightly off." I continued. "And the pressure, I tend to press harder on the second stroke of my last name. This one is too even." The officer beside the chief leaned in to look. "You're saying it's forged?" he asked. "I'm saying it wasn't written by me," I replied. But the signature itself wasn't the most disturbing part. The date was... I looked at the timestamp again, the numbers digging into my memory like splinters. "That day," I said slowly, "I wasn't at the office." The chief's eyes narrowed slightly. "Where were you?" "At the hospital," I answered. "My sister had surgery that afternoon. I stayed there most of the day." Silence filled the room again. Not empty silence. Thinking silence. The chief flipped to the next document. "Then explain this one," he said. He slid another authorization toward me. Larger amount. Different date. Same signature. My stomach dropped. There it was again. Marcus Hale. Perfectly written. Perfectly wrong. I stared at the second page, my pulse hammering in my ears. "One mistake might be coincidence," I said quietly. "Two means planning." The chief didn't argue. He didn't reassure. He simply watched. That was worse, because it meant he understood exactly what I was realizing. Someone had done this twice. Not rushed. Not panicked. Carefully. Confidently. I flipped another page myself before they could stop me. That's when the next piece appeared. A printed email, folded neatly into the stack. The chief slid it forward slightly. "Read the subject line," he said. I leaned in, my eyes locked on the bold text. "Finalize before he finds out." The words felt like ice sliding down my spine. Before he finds out? Not if. Before. Meaning whoever wrote it expected discovery eventually. They were racing time. I scanned the body of the email, my breathing growing tighter with every line. The sender's name had been partially redacted, but the tone felt familiar. Businesslike. Structured. Calm. Too calm. This wasn't sloppy. This was controlled. "Does this language sound familiar?" the chief asked. I hesitated. "Yes," I admitted quietly. "Internal communication style. Someone used to working within our system." The officer beside him shifted slightly. "Where was the authorization processed from?" I asked. The chief tapped another section of the report. "Authorized terminal," he said. "Inside your main office." That answer hit harder than anything else. Not remote. Not hacked. Not outside. Inside. "Which terminal?" I asked. "Finance department workstation," he replied. My throat tightened. That workstation wasn't open to just anyone. Restricted access. Keycard entry. Authorized personnel only. "How many people can use that station?" he asked. "Very few," I answered. "Senior staff. Trusted personnel." Trusted. The word tasted bitter in my mouth now. The chief flipped another page, scanning carefully before pausing. He didn't speak immediately. Instead, he looked up at me, directly. That pause stretched longer than it should have. "What is it?" I asked quietly. He studied me for another second before answering. "This terminal was accessed using credentials assigned to your brother-in-law." For a moment, I didn't understand the words. They didn't fit together properly. Brother-in-law. Credentials. Authorization. It didn't make sense. "That's impossible," I said. But even as the words left my mouth, Doubt followed close behind. Because technically, it wasn't impossible. My brother-in-law, Stephen, worked closely with vendor communications. He had legitimate access to portions of our internal system. Still, forgery. Fraud. No, that wasn't him. Was it? The chief watched my reaction carefully. You recognize the name? He asked. Yes, I answered slowly. He handles vendor coordination. The officer flipped back to the printed email. This message was sent during after-hours access, he said. Late evening. When most staff had already left. Late evening. Alone. Private. That detail changed everything. Because legitimate work rarely happened then. Not at that level. Not with those accounts. Have there been any recent changes in his behavior? The chief asked. My mind began searching memory without permission. Small conversations. Offhand remarks. Questions that once seemed harmless. Too many questions about account structures. Curiosity about legacy holdings. Requests for financial clarifications that didn't quite match his responsibilities. At the time, I ignored it. Trusted him. Family didn't require suspicion. That belief suddenly felt dangerously naive. This level of preparation suggests planning, the chief said quietly. Not speculation. Conclusion? And planning takes time, he added. Time. Weeks. Months. Possibly longer. The officer closed the folder slowly. The sound of paper sliding against paper echoed in the still room. Then the chief leaned forward slightly. You may not be the suspect here, he said. Those words landed differently than I expected. Not relief. Not comfort. Responsibility. Because if I wasn't the suspect, then I was the target. Before I could respond, he added another sentence. We'll need to examine everything inside your home office. That hit harder than anything else so far. My home office. Private records. Personal archives. Legacy documents. Everything. A slow realization crept through my chest. This wasn't just happening at work. It had already reached my home. My private life. My family. I leaned back slightly in the chair, staring down at the stack of documents still spread across the desk. My signature. Forged. My records. Accessed. My trust. Broken. And suddenly, one thought rose above all the rest. If someone had entered my office at work, what was waiting for me at home? The porch light was still on when I pulled into the driveway. It cast a pale circle across the front steps. The same light that had burned into my memory earlier that night when the police first knocked. Nothing about the house looked different from the outside. Same shutters. Same quiet street. Same still trees. But something inside me knew this house wasn't the same anymore. I stepped out of the car slowly, closing the door with more care than necessary. The neighborhood was silent. The kind of deep quiet that comes late at night when everyone else is asleep and unaware that someone's world has shifted. My hand hovered over the front door for a moment before I pushed it open. Inside, the lights were still on. Not bright. Just enough to keep the darkness from taking over. Eleanor sat in the living room, exactly where I expected her to be. Upright on the couch, hands clasped tightly in her lap. Her shoulders stiff with tension. She didn't rush to greet me. Didn't ask if I was all right. Didn't ask what had happened at the station. She just watched me walk in. That silence pressed against my chest like weight. Why didn't you say anything tonight? I asked. The question came out steadier than I felt. She looked at me slowly. Her eyes tired, rimmed with red, but still no immediate answer. Too long. That hesitation alone made something cold move through me. I didn't know what to believe, she said quietly. Not I trusted you. Not this is a mistake. Just uncertainty. That hurt more than the accusation itself. You didn't know what to believe, I repeated, my voice tightening. They showed up at our door in the middle of the night. Eleanor? And you stood behind them like you already knew something. Her shoulders dropped slightly. I didn't know how serious it was, she said. I saw notices earlier this week. Emails flagged. Statements delayed. Things that didn't make sense. My chest tightened. You saw something and didn't tell me. Her voice cracked slightly. I didn't understand it. The words hung in the air between us, heavy and unfinished. Then she added something that made my stomach twist. Someone contacted me, she said. I froze. What do you mean, contacted you? She swallowed slowly. An anonymous message, she whispered. A warning. It said something wasn't right with the accounts. That sent a chill through my body. Anonymous. Not official. Not transparent. Calculated. When did you get this? I asked. 3 days ago. 3 days. 3 days of silence. 3 days of doubt growing inside this house without me knowing. Why didn't you show it to me? I asked. My voice sharper now. I was scared, she admitted. Not angry. Not defensive. Afraid. That fear settled heavily in the room. I didn't respond. Instead, I turned toward the hallway. Toward my office. Something inside me felt wrong. Not just emotionally wrong, physically wrong. Like walking into a room where the air feels disturbed. The door to my office came into view, and my pulse spiked instantly. It was slightly open. Not wide. Not broken. Just enough to notice. I stopped in the hallway. I always locked that door. Always. Did you go into my office? I asked without turning around. No. Eleanor replied immediately. The answer came too quickly. Or maybe I just didn't trust anything anymore. I pushed the door open slowly. The room looked normal at first glance. Desk in place. Computer dark. Shelves lined neatly. But the feeling didn't match the appearance. Something was off. My eyes drifted toward the corner. Toward the safe. And my stomach dropped. The safe door wasn't closed. Not fully. It hung slightly open. Like someone had been interrupted. I walked toward it slowly, my heartbeat echoing loudly in my ears. That safe had never been left open. Not once. Not in years. I reached for the handle, my fingers stiff, and pulled the door wider. Inside, empty spaces, folders missing. Not everything. Just specific sections. Targeted sections. My breath caught in my throat. No, I whispered. I began scanning the contents, touching each file, flipping through what remained. Not random theft. Not panic. Precision. I knew exactly what was missing before I even confirmed it. Legacy account records. The same ones the chief had asked about earlier. That connection struck like lightning. Someone knew what to take. Someone understood the value of those documents. I turned sharply, scanning the rest of the room. Shelves slightly misaligned. Stacks shifted out of their usual order. Not chaotic. Calculated. I moved toward the ceiling corner, where the security camera was mounted. Another wave of cold moved through my body. The cable hung loose. Disconnected. Not torn. Not damaged. Unplugged. Deliberately. My pulse pounded harder now. Whoever did this hadn't rushed. They took their time. Planned the moment. Executed it cleanly. I stood in the center of the room, holding the empty folder slot in my hand, staring at the unplugged wire hanging like evidence of betrayal. Behind me, I heard soft footsteps. Eleanor. She stood in the doorway, her face pale in the dim light. You didn't touch anything in here, I asked quietly. No, she said again, but something in her posture made my chest tighten. Stillness. Distance. Fear. I turned fully toward her now. If someone entered this room, I said slowly, they either had a key. My voice trailed off, because the second possibility formed in my mind before I could finish the sentence. Or someone let them in. I stared at her, searching her face for answers she hadn't yet given. And for the first time since the police knocked on my door, the fear inside me changed shape. It wasn't just fear of accusation anymore. It was fear of betrayal. Inside my own home. I stayed in the office long after Eleanor walked away. The house had gone quiet again. But it wasn't peaceful quiet. It was the kind that pressed in on you, making every small sound feel louder than it should. The open safe still stared back at me like an accusation. I crouched down in front of it again, running my fingers along the empty spaces where the missing folders had been. Not random. Not careless. Whoever took those documents knew exactly what mattered. That thought tightened something deep in my chest. This wasn't just theft. It was selection. Precision. Someone had studied those records before they touched them, and that meant planning. I stood slowly and walked toward my desk, pulling the chair back and sitting down heavily. My eyes moved toward the computer screen. If someone unplugged the camera, maybe they thought that erased everything. But systems leave traces, even when people think they don't. I powered the system back on. The soft hum of the machine filled the room as the screen lit up, casting a pale glow across the desk. My hands moved faster now, muscle memory taking over as I accessed the security logs. Timestamps, connection logs, system records. Everything recorded automatically. Everything saved. Unless someone knew how to erase it. Please don't let them know how, I thought. The system loaded slowly. Too slowly. My pulse pounded harder with every second. Then the log appeared. There it was. A record showing the moment the security camera went offline. Late evening. After normal business hours. Long after I had left the office. Long after the house should have been secure. I leaned closer to the screen, reading the timestamp again. Not random. Not accidental. Deliberate. Someone had waited until the right moment. Someone who knew our routines. My throat tightened. This wasn't an outsider breaking in. This was someone inside. Someone who knew when the house would be quiet. Someone who knew how long they had. I clicked deeper into the system, opening additional logs tied to administrative access. Another list appeared. Names, credentials, authorization entries. My breath slowed slightly as I scanned the screen. Most entries looked normal. Routine activity. Scheduled access. But then, one entry caught my eye. Late night authorization. Not mine. Not standard. I froze. Only a few people had that level of clearance. Very few. Trusted individuals. Family. The word echoed in my head like something dangerous. I leaned forward, my fingers hovering over the mouse as I opened the details connected to that access point. The screen refreshed, then displayed a name. Daniel Mercer. My stepdaughter's husband. For a moment, my mind refused to accept what I was seeing. Daniel. No, that didn't fit. Daniel had always been polite, respectful, quiet. The kind of man who blended into family gatherings without drawing attention. Dependable. Or so I thought. I stared at the name again. Daniel Mercer. Repeated. Multiple access attempts. Not once. Not twice. Patterned. Deliberate. A memory surfaced without warning. Months earlier, during dinner at the house, Daniel had leaned forward casually and asked, "How long before those inheritance accounts activate?" At the time, I had laughed lightly, assuming curiosity. People asked questions about money all the time, especially family members who expected to be part of future planning. Now, that question sounded different in my memory. Not curious. Calculated. I leaned back slowly in the chair, staring at the screen as another memory surfaced. Daniel mentioning debt. Not dramatically. Just casually. Talking about a failed investment, a loan that didn't work out. I remembered nodding politely, offering mild encouragement, never thinking it mattered. Now it mattered. Everything mattered. I leaned forward again, opening the financial request logs tied to the missing legacy documents. Another entry appeared. Recent. Very recent. An attempted transfer request. Target account listed clearly. Future inheritance funds. Not operating capital. Not vendor payments. Inheritance. My inheritance? My daughter's inheritance. Everything my father built to protect this family. A cold realization moved through me. He wasn't stealing from the business. He was reaching into the future. Trying to take what wasn't even his yet. My hands tightened against the desk. Greed. Not desperation. Not survival. Greed. The phone rang suddenly, cutting through the silence like a blade. I flinched before reaching for it. The caller ID displayed the station number. The chief. I answered immediately. "This is Hale." "Mr. Halle," the chief said calmly. "We've completed additional tracing." My pulse quickened. "Tracing what?" "The attempted transfer route," he replied. "Funds were directed toward an external account established within the past 30 days. 30 days. That meant preparation. Planning. Not panic. "Do you have a name?" I asked. There was a brief pause on the line. "Yes," the chief said. I held my breath. "The account holder traces back to Daniel Mercer." The words landed exactly where I already expected them, but hearing them spoken aloud made the truth heavier. Final. Real. No denial left. No confusion. Just confirmation. I closed my eyes briefly, gripping the edge of the desk. Daniel. Family? Trusted. Now exposed. "That matches what I found here," I said quietly. Silence followed for a moment. Not uncomfortable. Just heavy. "We're moving carefully," the chief continued. "Whoever did this expected resistance eventually." I nodded, even though he couldn't see me. "I won't confront him yet," I said. That decision formed in my chest before the words left my mouth. Confrontation meant panic. Panic meant mistakes, and mistakes destroyed evidence. "Good," the chief replied. "Patience will give us leverage." After the call ended, I sat alone in the quiet office, staring at the glowing screen. Daniel's name remained there, highlighted, unavoidable. I leaned back slowly, letting the silence settle around me. The man I trusted to stand beside my family, the man I welcomed into my home, had been quietly dismantling everything behind my back. Not impulsively, not emotionally, strategically, carefully. That realization changed something inside me. The fear that had controlled me earlier began shifting into something colder, sharper. Anger. Not loud anger. Not reckless anger. Controlled anger. The kind that plans before it moves. I reached forward and closed the laptop slowly, the screen going dark beneath my fingers. The room returned to silence. But this time, it felt different. Not helpless. Not uncertain. Focused. This wasn't just betrayal anymore. This was war. And I wasn't going to lose. Morning came without sleep. I sat at the kitchen table long before sunrise, a cup of coffee growing cold in my hands. The house was quiet again. But this time the silence felt like waiting, like something unfinished hovering in the air. Eleanor stood near the counter, watching me carefully, as if she expected me to explode. I didn't. That was the first decision I made. Not to shout. Not to confront. Not yet. Because anger would destroy the one thing I needed most. Proof. "I know," she finally said softly. I didn't look up. "Know what?" I asked. "About Daniel," she replied. That made me lift my eyes. Her face was pale, tired, but steady. I suspected something. She continued. "Not everything, but enough to feel something was wrong." I stared at her, measuring every word. "Why didn't you tell me?" I asked. "Because I was afraid," she whispered. "Afraid of breaking the family apart." That answer stayed in the air between us. Fear. Fear had allowed this to grow. Fear had protected the wrong person. But anger wouldn't fix it now. Patience would. Later that morning, I met the chief in a quiet conference room at the station. No uniformed officers this time. No crowded desk. Just a table. A folder. And the steady hum of overhead lights. He slid a document toward me. "Second transfer attempt," he said. I leaned forward and scanned the page. Same structure. Same pathway. Blocked by the system before completion. "Failed?" I asked. He nodded. "Yes. Your legacy protection stopped it." That detail sent a strange sense of relief through me. My father's precautions. Still working. Still protecting. But relief didn't last long. Because failure meant something else. He'll try again, I said quietly. The chief watched me carefully. That's likely. I leaned back in the chair, thinking through every possibility. Blocking him wasn't enough. Stopping him once wouldn't end it. We needed certainty. We needed exposure. Let him try, I said finally. The chief's expression shifted slightly. You're suggesting we allow another attempt? He asked. Not allow, I corrected. Control. He remained silent, waiting. I leaned forward again. We create a pathway that looks vulnerable, I explained. A document that appears incomplete. A digital approval that looks accessible. Bait. The word hung unspoken between us. He studied me carefully before nodding once. That could work, he said. And just like that, the trap began. Later that afternoon, I returned home and sat in my office, building the file that would draw Daniel in. It had to look real, convincing enough to tempt him, flawed enough to appear exploitable. Every detail mattered. Every line. Every authorization field. I left the pathway visible. Not obvious. Subtle. Like a loose thread waiting to be pulled. Then came the hardest part. Waiting. Days passed slowly. Painfully slow. I moved through routine as if nothing had changed. Breakfast conversations stayed polite. Work meetings continued normally. No accusations. No confrontations. Daniel visited the house twice during those days. Each time, he acted exactly as he always had. Calm. Friendly. Relaxed. Too relaxed. I watched him carefully, every movement. Every glance. Every hesitation. He smiled at dinner. Asked routine questions. Talked about work. But once, just once, I caught his eyes drifting toward my office door. Not curiosity. Calculation. That was the moment I knew he would take the bait. It happened late in the evening. The house was quiet. Most lights were off. I sat alone in the living room, pretending to read while keeping my phone close. Then it buzzed. A soft vibration against the table. System alert. Unauthorized access attempt detected. My chest tightened instantly. I opened the notification. Administrative credentials in use. Timestamp. Current. Location. Home office. Daniel was inside. The realization hit like thunder. This was it. I stood slowly, dialing the chief without hesitation. It's happening, I whispered. His voice came immediately. Stay where you are. Minutes passed like hours. Every second stretched painfully long. I heard movement down the hallway. Keyboard clicks. Soft footsteps. Confidence. He thought he was alone. Then headlights flashed briefly through the front window. Unmarked vehicles. Silent arrival. The chief entered first, moving quickly but without noise. 2 officers followed behind him, their presence sharp and controlled. We moved together toward the office. The door was slightly open. Light spilled into the hallway. Inside, Daniel sat at my desk, focused, typing, unaware. Step away from the computer, the chief said calmly. Daniel froze. Not slowly. Instantly. His shoulders stiffened. Fingers hovering above the keyboard like they'd been burned. What is this? He asked. His voice cracked. Fear had entered it now. The chief stepped forward. We need you to stand up. Daniel turned slowly. His face had lost color. Gone was the calm confidence from dinner conversations. Gone was the friendly smile. Now there was only panic. I wasn't doing anything wrong, he said quickly. Too quickly. The officers stepped beside him, guiding him gently away from the desk. No sudden movements. One of them said, the chief turned the computer screen toward him. Digital logs glowed brightly. Timestamps. Credentials. Authorization attempts. Clear? Undeniable. Daniel stared at the screen, his mouth opening slightly. But no words came. Silence settled heavily in the room. Then the handcuffs clicked. Sharp. Final. Daniel flinched as metal closed around his wrists. I can explain, he muttered weakly. But there was nothing left to explain. Everything had already spoken. I stood in the doorway, watching, not shouting, not raging, just watching. Years of trust collapsing in seconds. The officers escorted him past me. His eyes briefly met mine. Fear, shame, regret, all of it visible now. Gone was the confidence. Gone was the deception. After they left, the house felt different. Quieter, safer, but heavy. Eleanor approached slowly, her hands trembling slightly. "I should have told you sooner," she said. Her voice broke. I suspected him. I just didn't want to believe it. I looked at her for a long moment. The anger I once felt toward her softened, not gone, but quieter. Fear had silenced her, just as betrayal had nearly destroyed us. Later, my phone rang again. The chief. "Your legacy protection saved everything," he said. I closed my eyes briefly, letting that sentence settle deep inside my chest. My father's preparation, his warnings, his discipline, still protecting us years later. I ended the call and walked back into my office. The files were restored. The system secure. The damage stopped. But as I stood there, looking at the desk where Daniel had been sitting just minutes earlier, one thought settled into my mind with absolute certainty. The battle was nearly over, but the consequences were just beginning. Morning arrived with a strange kind of silence. Not the tense silence that had filled the house days earlier. Not the suffocating quiet that followed fear. This one felt heavier, slower, like the world itself was catching its breath after everything that had happened. I sat alone at the kitchen table again, staring at the same cup of coffee that had gone cold before I even touched it. Sunlight pushed through the window in thin streaks, cutting across the floor like nothing had changed. But everything had changed. My phone buzzed against the table. Then again. And again. Notifications stacked one after another. Messages from employees. Calls from numbers I recognized and numbers I didn't. News travels fast in business. Faster than people realize. Word about Daniel's arrest had already reached the office. Justice doesn't stay quiet. I finally picked up the phone and answered the first call. "Mr. Hale, we heard what happened," one of the senior supervisors said, his voice careful. "Are the accounts secure?" "Yes," I replied. "Everything is locked down." Hearing myself say that felt strange. Secure. A word I hadn't trusted for days. After several calls, I met the chief again at the station. This time the room didn't feel threatening. No pressure. No suspicion. Just paperwork and confirmation. He slid a report across the desk. "Funds have been secured," he said. None of the transfers were completed successfully. I exhaled slowly, not realizing how long I had been holding tension in my body. "All of it?" I asked. "All of it," he confirmed. That single sentence released something inside me that had been locked tight since the first knock on my door. Relief didn't come loudly. It came quietly, like air returning to lungs after being held too long. The next few days passed in a blur of calls and conversations. Some people apologized. Some avoided speaking entirely. Others pretended nothing had happened. But the call that stayed with me the longest came from my daughter. Her voice shook when she spoke. "I didn't know," she whispered. "I swear I didn't know." I closed my eyes, gripping the phone tighter. "I know," I said gently. There was silence on the line. Not angry silence. Broken silence. She had trusted her husband the same way I had trusted him. That realization softened the anger I carried. Betrayal spreads like cracks in glass. It never breaks just one person. That evening, Eleanor sat across from me in the living room. The television stayed off. The house felt still, but not hostile anymore. She looked smaller somehow. Tired. Worn down by fear she had been carrying alone. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just honest. "I should have trusted you," she added. I let fear make my decisions. I studied her face carefully. The anger I once felt toward her didn't vanish, but it shifted, changed shape, became something less sharp. Fear had silenced her. Fear had allowed the wrong person to stay hidden. "We rebuild from here," I said finally. Not forgiveness. Not blame. Just truth. The next morning, I returned to my office. The same office that had felt violated days earlier now felt like a place that needed rebuilding. I opened the safe slowly, checking each folder, each document, each record. Everything had been restored. But restoration wasn't enough. Protection had to be stronger. I spent hours reviewing access permissions, restructuring authorization protocols, locking every possible weakness I could find. No single-person approvals anymore. No quiet backdoors. Every step verified. Every action witnessed. Trust wasn't blind anymore. Trust had rules. Later that week, I found myself standing somewhere I hadn't visited in years. The cemetery sat at the edge of town. Quiet and still under a pale afternoon sky, wind moved gently through the trees, carrying the smell of dry leaves and earth. I stopped in front of my father's grave. The stone looked unchanged. Solid. Steady. Just like he had been. I held a copy of the legacy account structure in my hand, the same one he had created years ago, the same one that had stopped everything from collapsing. For a long time, I didn't speak. I just stood there, remembering his voice. Never trust numbers without witnesses. Protect the family even from itself. At the time, I thought he was being cautious. Now I understood. "You were right," I whispered. The words came out quietly, carried by the wind. Gratitude replaced regret. Not just for the accounts, but for the lessons. When I returned home later that evening, the house felt different again. The hallway that once carried tension now felt calm. The office door stood closed. Locked. Secure. I stepped inside and walked toward the safe one last time. Everything in its place. Everything accounted for. I paused for a moment, letting the silence settle around me. Trust. That word meant something different now. Trust wasn't about comfort. It wasn't about familiarity. It was about responsibility. About boundaries. About protecting what matters before someone else decides to take it. I closed the safe slowly, turning the handle until it locked with a firm, final click. That sound echoed softly through the room. Secure. Final. Permanent. Not every battle ends clean. Not every betrayal gets exposed. But this one did. And if there's one thing I learned from all of this, it's that betrayal doesn't always come from strangers. Sometimes it walks into your home, sits at your table, smiles at your family, and waits. If you've ever been betrayed by someone you trusted, if you've ever faced accusations that made your world feel like it was falling apart, or if you've had to rebuild trust piece by piece after everything broke, then you understand exactly what this feels like. I'd like to hear your story. Tell me in the comments if you've ever had to stand your ground when everything seemed against you. Your experiences matter more than you think, and sometimes sharing them helps someone else feel less alone. And if stories like this speak to you, stories about justice, betrayal, rebuilding, and taking your power back, stay with me. There are more lessons to tell, more truths to uncover, and more moments where the tables turn when you least expect it. Make sure you stay connected, because sometimes the next story is the one that reminds you you're stronger than you ever believed. I turned off the office light and stepped into the hallway. The sound of the safe locked behind me still echoing faintly in my ears. For the first time in days, the house felt quiet in the right way. Not fearful. Not broken. Safe.